So tonight, on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am pleased to welcome Chuck Palahniuk to the First Parish Church. He's here tonight to discuss his latest novel, Tell All. Also with us tonight is the fabulous Ned Hinkle. And for those of you that don't know him, Ned Hinkle is the creative director of the Brattle Theater. He's worked extensively in both the music and film industries and currently handles all the programming, marketing, and special events at one of New England's finest independent movie theaters, the Brattle Theater. Mr. Hinkle has previously interviewed the likes of Jessica Lange, Geraldine Chaplin, RoboCop's Paul Verhoeven, and David Lynch. And in just a bit, we'll be inviting him onto stage to talk with Chuck Palahniuk. They'll discuss Hollywood's golden age and Chuck's new book, Tell All. And if you couldn't tell by the cover, Tell All is a scintillating new novel that is pure Hollywood, dripping with all the glitter, gossip, sex, and bloody backstabbing that you could possibly want. It's been said that the book is vintage Hollywood and also vintage Chuck. Chuck Palahniuk, as you know, is an award-winning writer. His 10 previous novels include the best-selling Fight Club, Invisible Monsters, Choke, Lullaby, and others. He's also the author of Fugitives and Refugees, a nonfiction profile of Portland, Oregon, as well as the nonfiction collection Stranger Than Fiction. Before becoming a novelist, Mr. Palahniuk wrote manuals on fixing trucks and was a member of the infamous Cacophony Society. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and thank you for your patience. Please join me in welcoming Chuck Palahniuk.
So, thank you very much for inviting me tonight. I started writing really late in life. I started in a kind of kitchen table workshop led by a writer named Tom Spanbauer. And Tom's theory was that writers write because they weren't invited to the party. And so I always appreciate it when I do get invited to a party. Thank you for inviting me to the party. And the world is full of a lot of really beautiful, lovely, sensitive stories, but tonight will not be. And that is kind of your warning that at some point this evening, I'm very likely going to say something that pisses you off. And that's kind of my job. So I'm sorry about that, but what the hell? This is what I do for a living. And throughout the evening, we're going to play some games. Oh, first of all, how many folks have never been to an author event? Never been to hear an author read work? Raise your hands. Okay, it's getting better all the time. It used to be that it was every hand. But tonight we're gonna play some games. I'm gonna read from something that was written specifically for tour, something that has not been published, that people can't get any other way, that was written just for you folks who made the effort to be here. Play some games, win some prizes, answer some questions, and read this very specific short story. And it looks very likely that you all will be able to compete in tonight's competition. Let's talk about minimalism. In minimalism, the way I was taught it from Tom Spanbauer, who learned it from Gordon Lish, you really keep your elements really pared down. You have the same number of characters from the very beginning as you do at the very end, that you do the very most you can do with a very minimal number of elements. And these include your objects as well as your characters and your settings, that instead of introducing new things ongoingly and losing energy every time you have to lapse into description of this another new thing, you keep things simple so that things accrue a greater sort of energy as you see them again and again in different circumstances. And the object, one of the through-line objects for Tell All, is Academy Awards or industry awards that initially mean something, but then gradually accumulate to the point that they become not an acknowledgement, but just kind of a hideous burden on the life of this person. So, throughout the evening, you will compete, if you choose, to inflate blow-up Academy Awards. And we have about 200 of them, so some of you might have to do more than one. And those of you who get your awards inflated first will win an inflated turkey. Because it was the only thing I could find. And for those of you who don't smoke and are really conscientious about aerobic exercise, you can compete in the suicide round. So first off, we're going to demonstrate how this little game works. Todd, would you be so kind? This is my fun part, where I try not to hit the camera. On your mark, get set. We'll do some more rounds. This isn't the only round. Start blowing your award. This is how the awards are won in Hollywood. Now you'll notice there are 3 compartments on this aircraft. This lowest portion is going to be the most difficult to inflate. That's one portion. The easiest portion is this smallest portion, and then there is the figure. And you are not fully inflated until you can hold the award over your head like this. Emily Dickinson used to do this at her readings. So pretty much every one of the stories, every one of the books that I write has got a paradox built into it. I like to have a story about something that is at odds with the content of the story. And I loved how in Portland, Oregon, whenever the anarchists are going to have a big social protest, a big civil disobedient riot, I love how they all call each other and say, "What are you going to wear?" "I don't know. I think I'm going to wear black, but like a black." And they all have to kind of be the same, that there is this sort of this bureaucracy to anarchy. And so Fight Club was supposed to be this comedy about the bureaucracy of anarchy and all the rules that were involved in anarchy. And I just loved the absurdity of the paradox of that. And this year's book, Tell All, I really loved romance novels. When I was little, my grandmother would have stacks of Harlequin romance novels. And they would come in, a dozen a month, I think. And she would just sit there and read them like candy. And every once in a while, we would sneak one away, and we would try to find the dirty parts. But they were so heavily coded, and the language was so elaborate and flowery that you couldn't find the dirty parts. His turgid manhood entered her salty depths. I can't get off to that. And I remember once pulling a Pearl S. Buck novel off the highest shelf, which is where Mom kept the Pearl S. Buck novels, because they were so racy. That's a big joke if you know Pearl S. Buck. And it was about the rape of Nan King. And there was one line that said, "And all the peasants had escaped the village except for one old woman. And the Japanese soldiers used the old woman again and again as if she were a young woman." And reading that, I had what, they danced with her? They took her out to dinner? And so I love that nature of romance novels, that language of really flowery, euphemistic language for really carnal, brutal things. And so in a way, I wanted to write Tell All using this really over-the-top, quote-unquote, beautiful language to talk about really base things. And in this case, it's a love story about hatred. The core of the book is the hatred of one person for another. And so, in that same vein, for tonight, I very much wanted to write a story that's told in the conventions of stand-up comedy, the really sort of cliched conventions of stand-up comedy, but it's not a funny story. So it uses all the tropes of Seinfeld to tell a story that's not necessarily a funny story. Again, creating that contrast, that paradox between what is being said and how it's being said. And so I'd like to read you a short story called Knock Knock that pretty much instantly sold to Playboy. It'll come out in the December Playboy, but you can say you knew it when. So, Knock Knock. And I have to also acknowledge that when I started writing in Tom Spanbauer's workshop, Tom would occasionally book us into these readings. He would get these readings in public places for us to present our work. And he would always arrange for us to read in places like sports bars and pool halls, where there were pinball machines and widescreen sports television and all this noise, and a whole bunch of people who really did not want to hear us read our creative writing shit. And so you either got washed out by all those people saying, "Shut the fuck up! I don't want to hear about your daughter's death." Or you started writing stories like I started writing to deal with that. So, knock, knock. It's like sex, okay? You're just supposed to be there and be quiet till I'm done. My old man, he makes everything into a big joke. What can I say? The old man loves to get a laugh. Growing up, half the time, I didn't have a clue what his jokes were about, but I laughed anyways. Down at the barbershop, it didn't matter how many guys my father let take cuts ahead of him in line. He just wanted to sit there all Saturday and crack people up, make folks bust a gut. Getting his sideburns trimmed was definitely a low priority. My old man says, "Stop me if you've heard this one before." The way my old man tells it, he walks into the oncologist's office and he says, "After chemotherapy, will I be able to play the violin?" In response, the oncologist says, "It's metastasized, and you've got about 6 months to live." And working his eyebrows like Groucho Marx, tapping the ash from an invisible cigar, my old man says, 6 months, he says, "I want a second opinion." So the oncologist, he says, "Okay, you've got cancer and your jokes stink." So they do the chemotherapy, and they give him some radiation like they do, even if the shit burns him up so bad on the inside that he tells me that taking a piss is like passing razor blades. He's every Saturday down by the barbershop telling jokes, even if now he's bald as a cue ball. I mean, he's skinny as a bald skeleton, and he's getting to haul around one of those cylinders of oxygen under pressure, like some little version of a ball and chain. He walks into the barbershop dragging that pressurized cylinder of oxygen with a tube of it going up and looping around his nose, over his ears and around his bald head, and he says, "Just a little off the top, please." And folks laugh. Understand me. My old man is no Uncle Milty. He's no Edgar Bergen. The man's skinny as a Halloween skeleton and bald, and going to be dead by 6 weeks, So it don't matter what he says. Folks are going to hee-haw like donkeys just out of their genuine affection for him. But seriously, I'm just not doing him justice. It's my fault if this doesn't come across, but my old man is funnier than he sounds. Maybe his sense of humor is a talent I didn't inherit. Back when I was his little Charlie McCarthy, the whole time growing up, he used to ask me, knock, knock, and I'd say, who's there? He'd say, old lady, and I'd say, old lady who? And he'd say, wow, I didn't know you could yodel. Me? I didn't get it. I was so stupid. I was 7 years old and still stuck in the first grade. I didn't know Switzerland from Shinola. But I want for my old man to love me, so I learned to laugh. Whatever he says, I laugh. By old lady, my guess is that he means my mom who ran away and left us. All my old man will say about her is how she was a real looker who just couldn't take a joke. She just was not a good sport. He used to ask me, when that Vinnie Van Gogh cut off his ear and sent it to that whore he was so crazy about, how'd he send it? The punchline is, he sent it by ear mail. But being 7 years old, I was still stuck back on not knowing who Van Gogh is or what's a whore, and nothing kills a joke. Nothing kills a joke faster than asking my old man to explain himself. So when my old man says, what do you get when you cross a pig with Count Dracula? I knew to never ask, what's a Count Dracula? I just sit there and get a big laugh ready for when he tells me, a hampire. And when he says, knock, knock, and I say, who's there? And he says, radio. And I say, radio who? And he's already started to bust a gut. When he says, radio not, I'm going to come in your mouth. Then what the hell? I just keep laughing. My whole growing up, I figure that I'm just too ignorant to appreciate a really good joke. Me, my teachers still haven't covered long division and all the multiplication tables. So it's not my old man's fault that I'm so dumb that I don't know what's come. My old lady who abandoned us, he says that she hated that joke. So maybe I just inherited her lack of humor. But love. I mean, you gotta love your old man. I mean, after you're born, it's not like you get a choice. Nobody wants to see their old man breathing out of some tank, going into the hospital to die sky high on morphine, and he's not eating a bite of that red-flavored Jell-O they serve for dinner. Stop me if I already told you this one. But my old man gets that prostate cancer that's not even like cancer because it takes 20, 30 years before we even know he's so sick. And the next thing I know is I'm trying to remember all the stuff that he's ever taught me. Like if you spray some WD-40 on the shovel blade before you dig a hole, the digging will go a lot easier. And he taught me how to tie a shoelace and make a foul shot in basketball, and he taught me jokes. Lots and lots of jokes. And sure, the man is no Robin Williams. But I watched this movie one time about Robin Williams, who gets dressed up with a red rubber ball on his nose and this big rainbow-colored afro wig and those big clown shoes with a fake carnation stuck in the buttonhole of his shirt that squirts water. And the guy's a hotshot doctor who makes these little kids with cancer laugh so hard that they stop dying. Understand me. These bald kid skeletons who look lots more worse off than my old man. It's amazing, but they get healthy, and that whole movie is based on a true story. What I mean is, we all know that laughter is the best medicine. All that time being stuck in the hospital waiting room, I read every copy of the Reader's Digest. And we've all heard that true story about the guy with a brain cancer the size of a grapefruit inside of his skull, and he's about to croak. All the doctors and priests and experts say that he's a goner. Only he forces himself to watch nonstop movies about the Three Stooges. This stage 4 cancer guy forces himself to laugh nonstop at Abbott and Costello and Laurel and Hardy and those Marx Brothers. And he gets healed by the endorphins and the oxygenated blood. So I figure, what have I got to lose? All I need to do is remember some of my old man's favorite gags and to get him started back laughing on the road to recovery. I figure, what could it hurt? So this grown-up son walks into his father's hospice room, pulls up a chair beside the bed and sits down. The son looks into his old man's pale, dying face and he says, so this blonde gal walks into a neighborhood bar where she's never been before, and she's got tits out to here and a tight little hiney, and she asks the bartender for a Michelob. And he serves her a Michelob, except he sneaks a Mickey Finn into her bottle, and this blonde goes unconscious, and every guy in the bar leans her over the edge of the pool table and hikes up her skirt and fucks her. And at closing time, they slap her awake and they tell her that she's got to leave. And every few days, this gal with the tits and the ass, she walks in and she asks for a Michelob and she gets a Mickey Finn and she gets fucked by the crowd until one day she walks in and she asks the bartender, can he maybe give her a Budweiser instead? Granted, I have not landed this particular shaggy dog story since I was in the first grade, but my old man, he used to love this next part. The bartender smiles so nice and says, what? You don't like Michelob no more? And this real looker, she leans over the bar all confidential and she whispers, just between you and me, she whispers, Michelob makes my pussy hurt. The first time I learned that joke, when my old man taught it to me, I didn't know what was pussy. I didn't know Mickey Finn. I didn't know what folks meant when they talked about fucking. But I knew that all of this kind of talk made my old man laugh. And when he told me to stand up and tell that joke in the barber shop, it made the barbers and every old man reading detective magazines laugh until half of them blew spit and snot and chewing tobacco out their noses. So tonight, the grown-up son tells his old, dying father this joke. Just the two of them alone in that hospital room, late at night. And guess what? His old man doesn't laugh. So the son tries another old favorite. He tells a joke about the traveling salesman who gets a phone call from some farmer's daughter he met on the road a couple months before. And she says, remember me? We had some laughs and I was a good sport. And the salesman says, how you doing? And the farmer's daughter says, I'm pregnant and I'm gonna kill myself. And the salesman, he says, damn, you are a good sport. At 7 years old, I could really put that joke over. But tonight, my old man is still not laughing. How I learned to say I love you was by laughing for my old man, even if I had to fake it. And that's all I want in return. All I want from him is a laugh, just one laugh. But he's not coming across with even a giggle, not a snicker, not even a groan. And worse than not laughing, the old man squints his eyes shut tight and opens them brimming with tears, and one fat tear floods out the bottom of each eye and washes down each cheek. The old man's gasping his big toothless mouth like he's screaming or panting but can't do neither, crying big tears down the wrinkles of both cheeks, just soaking his pillow. So this kid, who's nobody's little kid, not anymore, but who all he knows to do is tell these stupid jokes, he reaches into his pants pocket and takes out a fake plastic carnation flower that, just for laughs, sprays water all over the old crybaby's face. The kid tells about the Polahniuk, who's carrying a rifle through the woods when he comes across a naked gal laying back on a bed of soft green moss with her legs spread, and this gal is a real looker. And she looks at the Polahniuk and his gun, and she says, "What are you doing?" And the Polahniuk says, "I'm hunting for game." And this real looker, she gives him a big wink, and she says, "I'm game." So, pow! The Polahniuk shoots her. It used to be this joke constituted a gold-plated, bona fide, surefire laugh riot. But my old man still keeps dying. He's just boo-hooing and not even making an effort to laugh. And no matter what, the old man has got to meet me halfway. I can't save him if he doesn't want to live. I ask him, "What do you get when you cross a faggot with a kike?" I ask him, "What's the difference between dog shit and a nigger?" And he's still not getting any better. I'm thinking maybe the cancer's got into his ears. With the morphine and what all, it could be that he just can't hear me. So just to test, can he hear me? I lean into his old crybaby face and I ask, "How do you get a nun pregnant?" Then more loud, maybe too loud for this being a mackerel snapper hospital, I yell, "You fuck her!" In my desperation, I try fag jokes and wetback jokes and kike jokes. Really every effective course of treatment known to medical science. And the old man is still slipping away. Laying here in this bed is the man who made everything into a big joke. Just the fact that he's not biting scares the shit out of me. I'm yelling, "Knock, knock." And when he says nothing in response, it's the same as him not having a pulse. I'm yelling, "Knock, knock." I'm yelling, "Why did the existentialist cross the road?" And he's still dying. The old man's leaving me not knowing the answer to anything. He's abandoning me while I'm still so fucking stupid. In my desperation, I reach out to take the limp blue fingers of his cold, cold dying hand. And he doesn't flinch, not even when I grind a joy buzzer against the blue skin of his ice-cold palm. I'm yelling, "Knock, knock." And nothing kills a joke faster than asking my old man to explain himself. But I'm yelling, "Why did the old lady walk out on her laugh-a-minute, funny man jokester husband and her 4-year-old kid?" And laying there in that bed, my old man, he stops breathing, no heartbeat, totally flatlined. So this kid who's sitting bedside in this hospital room late at night, he takes out the joke equivalent of those electric paddles doctors use to stop your heart attack, the hee-haw equivalent of what a paramedic Robin Williams would use on you in some clown emergency room, a kind of Three Stooges defibrillator. The kid takes a big, creamy, heaped-up custard pie topped with a thick, thick layer of whipped cream, the same as Charlie Chaplin would save your life with. And the kid reaches that pie up sky high overhead, as high as the kid can reach, and brings it down hard, lightning fast, slam dunking it as hard as the blast from a Polahniuk shotgun. Pow! Right in his old man's kisser. And despite the miraculous, well-documented healing powers of the comedic arts, my old man dies taking a big bloody shit in his bed. No, really, I swear. It was funnier than it sounds. Please don't blame my old man. If you're not laughing at this point, it's got to be my fault. I just didn't tell it right, you know? You mess up the punchline, and you can totally botch even the best joke. For example, I went back to the barber shop, and I told them how he died and how I tried to save him, right up to and including the custard pie, and how the hospital had their security goons escort me up to the crazy ward for a little 72-hour observation. And even telling that part, I fucked it up. Because those barbershop guys, they just looked at me. I told them about seeing and smelling my old man, dead and smeared all over with blood and shit and whipped cream. All that stinking sugar. And they just looked at me and looked at me. The barbers and the old guys chewing tobacco, and nobody laughed. And standing in that same barbershop all these years later, I say, knock, knock. The barbers stopped cutting hair. The old goobers stopped chewing their chewing tobacco. I say, knock, knock. Nobody takes a breath, and it's like I'm standing in a room full of dead men. And I tell them, death! Death is there! Don't you people never, ever read Emily Dickerson? You never heard of Jean-Paul Stewart? I wiggle my eyebrows and tap the ash from my invisible cigar, and I say, who's there? I say, I don't know who's there. I can't even play the violin. What I do know is I've got a brain filled with jokes that I can't ever forget, like a tumor the size of a grapefruit inside of my skull. And I know that eventually even dog shit turns white and stops stinking. But I have this permanent head filled with crap that I've been trained my whole life to think is really funny. And for the first time since I was that little stooge standing in that barbershop saying fag and cunt and nigger and saying kike, I figure out that I wasn't telling a joke. I was the joke. I mean, I finally get it. Understand me. A bona fide gold-plated joke is like a Michelob served ice cold with a Mickey Finn by somebody smiling so nice that you won't never know how bad you've been fucked. And a punchline is called a punchline for a very good reason, because punchlines are a sugar-coated fist with whipped cream hiding the brass knuckles that socks you right in the kisser, hitting you pow, right in your face, and saying, I am smarter than you, and I am bigger than you, and I call the shots here, buddy boy. And standing in that same old Saturday morning barbershop, I scream, knock, knock. I demand, knock, knock. And finally, one old barbershop codger, he says in barely a tobacco whisper, so soft that you can hardly hear him, he says, who's there? And I wait for a beat, just for the tension. My old man, he taught me that timing is crucial. Timing is everything. Until finally, I smile so nice, and I say, radio. That's knock, knock. So at this point, Ned is going to help me out since I'm completely out of breath. And we're going to talk some back and forth, and then we're going to ask for some questions from you all, and then we're going to blow some more stuff up. Which sounds political, doesn't it?
In case you guys don't think that I commiserate with you on the inflatability contest, who do you think blew up those statues over there before we came out? and Heather over there. So yes, I'm Ned Hinkle. I book movies for a living. So I was intrigued to learn about the topic of Chuck's newest novel, which delves shamelessly into the trivia of Golden Age Hollywood. And it evokes some of the more memorable people from that time, notably in the description of the narrator as a Thelma Ritter type, which I'm a big fan of Thelma Ritter, actually.
Everybody is.
Yeah.
Everybody loves Thelma Ritter.
Right. In case you don't know who she is, she's sort of the quintessential character actress, appearing in probably most famously Rear Window, I think. I mean, probably the most that people have ever seen.
All About Eve, The Misfits.
Yep. And Pillow Talk, The Hopeless Drunk in Pillow Talk.
She was married to Tex Ritter for a million years. Yeah.
And she's famous as somebody who was nominated for multiple Oscars and never won. So when you were talking about awards earlier, it came to mind. But tell me about what... Have you ever written a book in that's sort of a period piece before? Which this sort of is in a abstract kind of way.
No, I really haven't, but the only reason why this is sort of set in a back part of history, set in the past, is that it was going to be a book in which I wanted to name drop relentlessly, and I didn't want to get sued.
Right. So it's a good tactic to choose people who are already deceased.
And one of my favorite things to do is always to find a nonfiction form, because that will allow me to tell an even more fantastic fictional story while lending it a sense of gravity. Again, it's that paradox. It's telling a fantastic story using a very realistic form. You know, Citizen Kane would have been a really melodramatic, kind of miserable movie if it wasn't set in the context of newsreels and reporters. And that lent it that sense of credibility. And you see that done again and again, you know, in Fargo, the big single card opening that says the events you're about to see are based on the truth. Mm-hmm. Because otherwise, it's just kind of a silly comedy like Raising Arizona. But that single card opening gives it a sense of tragedy that makes it seem much deeper, even though that's a total lie. It's not based on true events. Mm-hmm. So using a nonfiction form of Walter Winchell or Hedda Hopper's gossip columns allows me to study all those conventions, like the conventions of bad stand-up comedy, and to use them to tell a kind of inappropriate story, so that the form and the conventions of the form actually play against the nature of the story. Mm-hmm. And that's why I said it in the past, so I wouldn't get sued by the people depicted, and so that I could use a form from the past that it was ubiquitous at that time.
Something that, I mean, being written in the style of sort of a flashy gossip column, obviously allows that name dropping. And I wanted to ask you about the bolding. If anybody has anybody cracked open the book to look at it? All of the name dropping to the point where the trademark names of pills and famous diseases and things like that are bolded. So, I mean, obviously that's the name dropping, but how hard did you think about how far to take it?
You know, my rule was if it's a proper noun, boldface it, because that's kind of the rule of those columns was, you know, you wanted to be able to skim and figure out what Brenda Fraser was doing, you know, what your specific celebrity was up to. And also the other quality of those columns was how they invented language that Walter Winchell called divorces renovations. And called gangsters from Chicago were called Chicagorillas. And it gave language this sort of slangy, plastic quality that exists still to a certain extent, like Benifer and Bradulina.
Right.
We have that to a smaller extent, but back then it really was an ongoing thing. And columnists could every week invent words that would instantly disseminate into the culture and be commonly used by people within a week. And so language was reinvented on a daily basis. And so I got to do that as well.
Did you do a lot of research with those columns? Because those kinds of phrases are cited a lot in the book, are all of those really taken from the column, or did you start to invent your own?
I only started with a couple. I think I started with renovations, and the term, the Sidney Skolsky code for lesbian was baritone babe. And so I to establish the precedent, to introduce the precedent, I used a couple real ones. But then beyond them, I invented all my own. And sometimes I purposefully kind of swung out and I used ones that they never ever could have put into print, that were just really over the top, like pink pucker sucker.
Yeah.
Which was my code for lesbian. And so just playing with this constant reinvention of language the way they used to do was another convention I could borrow.
In reading the book and thinking about the themes of it and what in the world to talk with you about, not that it's hard, it's not hard. I'm struck by the incredible multi-layeredness of lies and deceit, from the different people in the book against each other, and then also from you as the author to the people in the book, and it sort of the quote on the back of the jacket, which is paraphrasing, right?
Mary McCarthy.
Yeah. So the two lead characters, well, three if you include the cad, are all fictional, but everybody else, more or less, in the book is a real life character, right?
Who is dead and cannot sue me.
Exactly. Yeah. Including the main antagonist, who is Lillian Hellman, right? And that's who this quote was. The quote is on the back. It says, "Every word he's written about me is a lie, including and the." But that's a paraphrasing of a quote that Mary McCarthy famously said about Lillian Hellman.
Right.
But that was every word she writes is a lie.
Right.
So do you feel a kinship with Hellman in terms of, being when you write fiction, do you feel that in some ways you're telling lies, because you're making things up, telling stories?
The why I used Hellman was because she is such a wonderful example of something that we tend to think of as just something of our time. We look at James Fry and we think, he made it up, he lied, he has to be really punished. And a generation ago, it was Lillian Hellman. And a generation before that, it was Margaret Asquith, who would kind of self-aggrandize and self-mythologize. And I think that we all do it. And we all do it, and we all feel terrible about it. And so when we catch someone publicly doing it and making money from it, we have to crucify them because we recognize our own fault in them. Mm-hmm. And in a way, we have to exonerate ourselves. We have to somehow, come to terms with our own self-mythologizing and lying by making an example out of a public figure when they do it. Mm-hmm. And so, in a way, another part of setting it in the past was to kind of demonstrate that what we think of as just the modern problems of our time have been the problems of all time, and to sort of demonstrate that we're just part of a repeating pattern of basically the same things.
One of the things that, when we were talking before, not to ruin anything, but the names that are dropped throughout the book sort of become increasingly more arcane. And one of the things that I think it really drives home is the ephemeral nature of fame and the ephemeral nature of film. From my perspective, you were talking about the paradox and how you always try to find one. And I was thinking about the sort of inherent irony that there is in being on film and being a film performer, the way we think of the image of film as being a permanent fixture. But in reality, the physical nature of film is completely transient, and it can dissolve. And you mentioned that you had originally wanted to use the names of all silent movie stars. How did you feel about that?
Originally, I'd written the entire book using the names of silent stars, and my editor kicked it back, saying, I like the book, but the names are just too esoteric. I have no idea who these people are. Jill Esmond, he didn't know who Jill Esmond was? People that I consider still kind of famous, but he said, nobody's going to get it. Mm-hmm. They're going to think these are completely made-up names. And I love the irony that these people that I was citing were people who were internationally famous. They were the most famous people in the world, and it was thought that their greatness, that their beauty, their talent, their work would exist for the rest of human history. And within 50, 60 years, they were completely obscure, mm-hmm. completely erased. And so that's why I switched from silent film stars to stars of the 30s and 40s.
Right. And and the bolding goes beyond just the movie stars. It's famous intellectuals and politicians, and an incredible passage where Hellman is relating her involvement in the Manhattan Project, and all of the famous designers are coming to say what the bomb should look like, and all these incredible people that are just dropped in passing. It's not, it's almost like they're as ephemeral as sort of the image in general.
And it's even more, on a more basic level, this is the kind of, there's usually a few genesis things that happen that generate the whole book. And a couple years ago, I was helping promote the movie Choke that was made from my fourth novel. And I was in New York with Sam Rockwell, who was in the movie. And we were talking at lunch, and Sam was telling me about being in the movie about Jesse James that was filmed in Winnipeg with Brad Pitt. And at one point, he stopped himself, and he got very self-conscious, and he goes, Christ, would you just listen to me? I just keep going, blah, 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 Brad Pitt, blah, 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 Brad Pitt. And he said, it sounds like I have some kind of name-dropping form of Tourette syndrome. And I started to recognize that the names of people, especially celebrities, do function as a kind of non-language. They come in like the bark of a dog or the sound of a bird, mm-hmm. that doesn't really function like a verb or a preposition. It's just a kind of a macro that just pops in with its own associations to generate an association of status, or it just functions like a little piece of poetry, because half the time you don't know who they're even talking about. Right. You just nod your head and say, oh, I meant to read that book.
Oh, I'm so guilty of that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so in a way, these names I wanted to insert them so that they did function as this kind of almost gibberish poetry, because ultimately that's all they become.
Well, and I love the use of the bolding towards that end is actually kind of remarkable, because when you're reading along, I don't know if everybody experiences it, but when I read, I can sort of hear the voice in my head, and every time I would hit a bolded something, it would sort of turn into a yell, inside my head. Like suddenly somebody was shouting, Walter Winchell, or, whatever. And then there's also a description in the book of how Lillian Hellman's insufferable monologues turn into the sounds of like the jungle soundtracks from Tarzan movies, punctuated by the names of celebrities or whatever. I thought that was a remarkable description. Let's see. What else is going on? I know there was... Look, I'm going to pull out my cheat sheet. Tell me about I'm curious how you came... I don't know if there's even a story behind it, but it seems like the book could have been about Hellman, but you chose to take a perspective that was by the people affected by that world. And Hazy and Catherine as the leads. Catherine is a sort of, at the time the novel is set, in the alternate reality that the novel is set in. She's a fading movie star, and Hazy is her girl Friday, essentially, for all intents and purposes in the novel. How did those characters come to you?
When we were at Park City, Utah, for the Sundance Festival, when the people who made the Choke movie were looking for a distributor and they had their showing, and they sold the movie to Fox. Fox bought it, and then everyone's cell phone rang, and everybody got the same text that said Heath Ledger died. And it was amazing to be in Park City as a million people got the text, Heath Ledger is dead. But I noticed walking around all the movie stars who were doing their publicity, having to walk from one media outlet to the next. Primarily women were just incredibly beautifully groomed, just these incredibly gorgeous, perfect objects that were completely unencumbered. They didn't carry coats. They didn't even wear coats. They were walking in high heels, fully made up, beautifully coiffed, with their hands empty, burdened with nothing but gorgeous jewelry. And they wandered like these forest creatures through this snowy landscape, oblivious to the fact that they were the center of all these paparazzi. And I noticed that always about maybe 15 steps behind them was a kind of mousy, heavy-set woman burdened with coats and totes and makeup bags and purses and all the things that went to supporting this gorgeous thing that seemed to be walking independently. And that there were these kind of pack mules, these Sherpas, who were not the Jungian other of this gorgeous thing. And they carried the burden of the perfection, the burden of the ongoing beauty of the thing that walked ahead of them. And when no one was looking, they might rush forward and just tuck a stray hair, or they might powder a nose. But they always stayed so far back that they were never in the photograph. They could never be linked to that beautiful thing. And so I was absolutely fascinated. Everyone would look at Charlize Theron, but I was always looking to see, okay, where is all her shit? And it's all hanging around that dumpy woman over there. And so I was always looking at who is the pack mule. And I got fascinated with this sort of class of pack mules that kind of bear the burden of the beautiful object. And that was another, source of the novel.
Well, it certainly comes across in a lot of passages and descriptions that she's sort of the assistant of Dorian Gray. So I really like that, the idea that she's a porter, and that you took it from physicality to sort of emotional and physical appearance and all kinds of things. I want to ask one more question, and I'm going to make it more general one about films and adaptations and things like that. But when you were talking about at the beginning of the talk about minimalism and being restrained in terms of the number of characters and settings and objects and things, how do you feel that works in terms of a film adaptation, where a lot of the time the instinct or the impulse from filmmakers or studios or whoever is to put more on screen? I'm curious how you feel like that's come across in your films or in other adaptations of your novels or in other adaptations of other people's work.
Let's talk about IR 11.
Okay.
Ira Levin was a genius at that. Ira Levin said, okay, we need an apartment, and we need an apartment, and we need an apartment. And all of Rosemary's Baby basically takes place in 7 rooms.
Mm-hmm.
Or we need a suburban house, and we need a suburban house. And the Stepford Wives takes place pretty much in one place.
Mm-hmm.
And Death Trap. We don't need shit for Death Trap. Death Trap is 1 room. Death Trap is perfect. It's 3 players, it's 4 players, and 1 room.
Mm-hmm.
And by using really, really limited elements and making those elements do their duty over and over and over in escalating ways, you can get to a place that $1,000 million sets
Mm-hmm.
and a cast of tens of thousands are not going to get you to.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I see big budget movies where the frame is always filled full of action and detail and things happening, and it just bores me. But I see a movie like Session 9, where it's 5 guys taking the asbestos out of an abandoned mental hospital.
Mm-hmm.
And those 5 guys are such limited resources, are forced to play off of each other, that the kind of psychological burden automatically accelerates. Because we're not stopping to introduce a new thing. We're not getting another establishing shot, another big ballroom. You know, I think the Titanic should have been much smaller. And it would have made a better story.
Mm-hmm.
So every time we have to go to description to introduce a new thing, a new person, we lose energy.
Mm-hmm.
And Ira Levin knew that. So we need 4 people, we need at most 2 apartments, the end.
Mm-hmm.
And he did, God bless him, he did incredible things with very limited stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe because he got his start in low budget live television, where you had no resources and no budget,
Right.
and you still had to do something incredibly dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
But I always see, you know, Ira Levin as that thing to attain.
Yeah.
Doing more with less.
Right. Yes, it's true. I mean, and I look at the sort of USC or UCLA grad problem. People who are trained in how to use millions and millions of dollars in a budget, and then they make maybe a short film, and they get to make a superhero movie for Hollywood. And they don't know the economics of it. They don't know that, you know, the same things that have been learned from doing television production or doing low-budget films or things like that ends up in a Session 9 or Moon with Sam Rockwell. You know,
Moon was incredible, wasn't
it's
it?
him and him. And that's basically it.
And Kevin Spacey's voice.
The voice of
Yeah.
Kevin Spacey. You can't go wrong using the voice of Kevin Spacey. But anyways, I think that's all the time we have for this portion, unless you want to.
So what I'd like to do, just to break things up before we take questions, I'd like to blow some more shit up. Okay? I should be hearing blowing right now, because we have got almost winners.
Yeah. Very, very nice.
Go ahead, give them one.
Thank you so much.
Okay, we got one. Okay. Now, your questions. So, if you ask a question, guess what? You get a turkey. This is the turkey in a little box. It comes in a cute little box. So, there's a microphone here. If you've got a question, let's keep going until we run out of turkeys.
All right, I've got a question. My boyfriend's mother and I are in a fight over you. And She claims that you like to jerk around and manipulate your readers. She and I both dropped one of your books, and we cannot remember for the life of us which one it was, with the lobster scene. And she said, I'm done. When she got to that scene, she said, this guy, he's a jerk, he's manipulated me to no end. And when I read that scene, I said, I'm hooked, give me everything he's written. So she said, if I'm gonna come see you, to find out how you feel about that feeling. Is it manipulation? Is it intense description? Is it both?
Personally, I kind of liked being manipulated. There's forms of manipulation that really I can't stand, and that's when, what was the movie with Julia Roberts about the lawyer?
Aaron Brockovich.
Aaron Brockovich. The moment they bring us into a room with 8 dying children, that's not subtle.
No.
And there's certain sort of things that are presented that are instantly, I just feel like I'm being, I watched Forrest Gump with friends once, and we came out and somebody said, I feel like I've just been emotionally jerked off. Because there were these things that were so blatantly there, bits of music, scenes of incredible pathos, that were just put in very briefly in order to sort of jerk an emotional reaction out of you. And those are the things, that kind of manipulation I resent, I don't react to. But I think that I present kind of coarse things, coarse or shocking things, for ultimately kind of a sentimental reason. Instead of, I try to, again, present that paradox where you've got this angry, horrible thing that's really about heartbreak, that you can't say I love you anymore. You have to pretend that you hate the person, and that says I love you. That there's got to be more effective, indirect ways of expressing these sentiments that can't be directly expressed anymore because we've become a little too sophisticated to hear I love you as anything except for a cliche. And so, yeah, I'm just trying to tell your mother, I'm just trying to say I love you.
Will do, thank you.
So I know you're putting out about a book a year right now, and obviously that time frame must work for you. And my question, I guess, is whether you follow a similar sort of writing process with the research and the writing and editing and everything with each book, or if each book with the content makes it a little bit different.
It's pretty similar book to book. It really is. That I start writing longhand. I write longhand for a long time, usually a year. And then as the weather gets really poor over the winter, I start to keyboard it. And last year was very, very different. Last year, my mother was diagnosed suddenly with lung cancer. And she was, she had about a year. And so I went to live with her, and I took care of her for a year. And everything had to be very quiet. We were either in the hospital where everything was quiet, or we were in her home where everything was quiet. And so for the first time, I wrote tell-all while she was dying. And that's why I think the language is very different, because I don't have any kind of music playing as I work. It's much more of a language-based book. And I wrote next year's book, which is called Damned, really right up to the day she died. And so that process was very, very different for me, because I was writing in this very subdued, very isolated way, where in the past I've always written publicly. I've written longhand. So yeah, it changes a little bit, but I don't have any more mothers to die, so it's not going to happen that way again. And it's funny because really tell-all is about someone killing this grand mythic figure while preserving a mythology, which is what we kind of do when our parents die. We start to mythologize them. what's the word?
Mythologize? Mythologize?
We start to build them up, their story of them. We turn them into something that much, much more than they were, either worse than they were or greater than they were.
Sure.
And I just started that process early. So, yeah.
Thanks.
Cheers. I like how a lot of your recent books, you're all playing with different genres and different styles of writing. Have you ever considered writing a play or going into theater?
I would love to write a play, that my book Snuff, which is about loosely based on the Annabelle Chong world record-setting gangbang porn shoot that was originally that was originally written as a play. It was a play because it really does take place in one room with a very small number of characters. And I wrote it as a play and realized that selling it as a play is a whole different animal. So I turned it into a novel. But no, I love the play form. And plays do so much, again, with so little. It really is like R11, like minimalism, where you have one limited setting, limited number of characters, limited time limit. Everything has to happen with almost no resources. So no, I think plays are a terrific form, like short stories. You know, I love a short story that can do so much in 7 pages. But I've never produced a play.
You should.
Okay.
I already have one. Yes! Oh, thank you. Okay, I'm kind of nervous, but I've read a lot of your books, and I was just wondering if you wrote any of the characters to relate to you.
Are any of the characters me?
Relate to you.
Relate to me.
Or do you put like a piece of you in each character?
Boy, I ran out of me a long time ago. No, seriously. And my degree is in journalism. And I think so much of what a creative person does, if they're going to have a long-lasting career, if they're going to be productive over time, is that they really become more like an editor and a harvester, somebody who is constantly observant and listening in the world and listening for things that other people say that have this kind of profound, listen to me, blah, 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 Brad Pitt, that strike a chord with me, and I recognize the brilliant thing that they've just said, and I steal it. That's really what it is to be a creative person, is to be constantly out there stealing. And the fact that I'm doing it kind of puts me in the story, but I ran out of autobiographical stuff in my work, Okay, my mother's death is kind of in there, but no, nothing really literal, no. Let me think. There's a lot of autobiographical stuff in Invisible Monsters.
Yeah.
My dad used to work for the railroad, and he would come home in the middle of the night, and he would wake us all up, and we'd have to get in a truck and drive out in the middle of nowhere because there'd been a train accident, and he knew we could steal stuff until dawn. And so we'd all be out there in our pajamas in the middle of the desert in this freezing cold wind, stealing lumber or stealing whatever was spilling out of these derailed boxcars. And I wrote that into Invisible Monsters. So there are these little things here and there, but those are mostly in the earlier novels. So.
That's my favorite book.
There you go. Thank you.
Thank you.
So in a lot of your books, you have a lot of very random and interesting facts. I think most notably for me in Survivor, just a lot of things. And is there a way you go about researching these very tiny but interesting facts, and how much of it is true, I guess?
A lot of writers research in order to write, and I like to think of myself as a writer that writes in order to have the excuse to research. And that's why I got a journalism degree, because I thought that, if I have a journalism degree, it's kind of a permission, it's an ongoing license to be meeting people. It's okay, I'm a reporter, you can talk to me. And to have a really rich, interesting life where I'm around people who are accomplishing things, and I'm around disasters, I'm around good and bad things. But then I got a degree in journalism, and I realized that it means being around planning council meetings and school board meetings and a bunch of stuff that just bored the crap out of me. So now when I'm working on something and I need a bunch of detail, that's my excuse, my permission to go out and to interview people in the world and to find out those details from the individuals themselves. And it kind of, I don't know how to be with you. I have no idea how to do this. I don't know what to say. I don't even know what to do with my hands while I'm doing this. So I have to bring all this stuff so that I have a structure, and I have to bring a script so that I have a rough idea of what to say next. Because otherwise, I'm kind of a social retard. And the same way with research. I can walk into your office and I can say, you're an expert at blank, tell me all about it. And so the research really gives me a way of being with people. And that's all I want, is just to live my life around other people. So,
Thank you.
Thank you. So my question is, you said you got to writing fiction kind of late. And I'm wondering what it was that drew you to fiction specifically, and how the process was for you writing your first book.
I got to writing fiction really late, I think when I was 33. And I started doing it to keep my mind occupied at work, because we would have these long stretches at work when we were waiting for parts. I worked at Freightliner, and we would find out that we couldn't complete a repair procedure on a truck because the parts hadn't come in. And everyone had to sit around, and I needed something to keep me from, everyone else would go out and smoke dope. And I needed something to keep my attention. So I would start to write these stories. And then I got into a writer's workshop that I met around someone's kitchen table. Andrea Carlisle. And she was just a really honest, earnest writer of short stories. And then she read a scene in my first novel, which was 800 pages of garbage. But it's the scene that I later kind of transplanted. I took out this scene. It was one of the few things I could save from this terrible long thing. And it was the scene that subsequently in the novel Snuff, where the protagonist is obsessed with a woman. So he buys a sex doll, and he grooms it, and he styles it so it looks as much like his beloved as possible. And then he seduces it. He enacts this drama with it. And as he's having sex with it, he realizes that in unzipping the back of its dress, he's snagged it in a tiny, tiny way, and it's slowly losing air. And that he has got to complete the act before it's completely flat. And this beautiful, smooth thing that was so nice looking is gradually shrinking and wrinkling and going from a beautiful woman to a kind of a withered hag to this kind of hideous mummy, this leathery, awful thing beneath him, as he's pumping away faster and faster. And by the end of the scene, this horrible, deflated pink thing is hanging off of his erection, and he still hasn't gotten off. And dear sweet Andrea Carlisle read that scene and said, "We don't want you here anymore." There are just some members of the group who don't feel safe with you here. And she said there's a writer named Tom Spanbauer who just moved to Portland, and he's taking students. So you might just haul your obscene ass over there. And it was perfect, because Tom was writing the kind of very dynamic, very edgy stuff that made me excited to write. And in Tom's workshop, we focused on short stories. If you can't do it in 7 pages, you sure as hell can't do it in 700 pages. So 7 pages was the ideal length for a story. And 7 pages, I could keep that hidden at work. And I could pull that out and line edit it at work anytime I wanted to. And you could put 7 pages underneath a truck manual, and no one will ever find it. And so that's how I started writing. And once my stuff was good enough, Tom recommended his agent. And that's how I got an agent. And yeah, I hope that answered that.
Thanks.
My question is, how well do you think the movies did that came from your books did to portray the meaning behind the books?
You know, number one, I am not a big meaning person. I think at best, a story is a compelling object in which the consumer finds a meaning. It's kind of a Rorschach test in which I hope a reader finds a connection, a way in. I hope that there's some aspect of the story that resonates with the consumer, the reader's life. That's my goal, that there's something in this compelling thing that will hold their attention and also resonate with some unexpressed part of their life. Beyond that, I'm not going to dictate a single meaning. So in that way, I'm off the hook. But I think that there are aspects of the story that are kind of sacrosanct. And in both Choke and Fight Club, there is a public deception taking place, where in Fight Club, a person goes to support groups for terminally ill people and allows those people to feel that he is also dying like they are, and so that they have a way of being with him and consoling him and allowing him to express his emotions. And that's a big lie. It's a big inauthenticity. Likewise, in Choke, the protagonist pretends to choke in restaurants so that people think that they've saved his life. They think that they had a moment of fantastic heroism where they themselves stepped out of the crowd and saved a human being's life. And in doing so, he gets hugged. He gets that physical contact with a stranger. And I think if you have a social inauthenticity, that the contract is that that character who is the deceptor must be brought back to that context, must be unmasked, revealed, humiliated, and the people who were deceived must be given the option of either accepting that flawed, deceptive person or rejecting and shunning that person. And in Fight Club and Choke, in the books, we do have that third act scene where the social inauthenticity is completed and the character is subjugated to the people that he has deceived. And in both the movies, we never came back to that scene. And David Fincher, he said, you know, we were at 2 hours and 20 minutes. We couldn't fit that scene into the movie. And Clark Gregg, the director on Choke, said, you know, we shot that scene, but we shot the whole sequence too dark. And we don't have the money to reshoot it. And I have to wonder, though, actors and acting people are so invested in being sympathetic and likable, both as people and as their characters, that I have to wonder if movies are just a place that can't go to that point of humiliation, that can't risk looking that bad publicly. Because it seems like an odd coincidence that exactly the same element is missing from both movies. And that's why it has to be in the book or on the page. Because you're not going to like the guy who tells you the knock-knock story. And actors really want to be liked.